Charlotte Bennet slammed her father's will onto Margaret's kitchen table, the same table where that woman had smiled through his funeral, and said, her voice dead calm, "Read it." Every word. Margaret didn't even look down. She just picked up the deed with the Charlotte's father's name still on it, set it aside like it was nothing, and said, "Your father is gone, Charlotte. And so is your place in this house." 3 days after burying the only person who had ever loved her, Charlotte was standing on a dirt road with $60 and nowhere left to go until a lone cowboy stopped his horse and changed everything. If you've ever been cast out by the very people who were supposed to protect you, stay with me. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far Charlotte's story travels. The morning after the funeral, Charlotte woke before the sun. She had not slept, not truly. She had lain in the narrow bed of her childhood room and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house breathe around her, the familiar creak of the floorboards settling, the distant sound of horses shifting in the stable, the low moan of Montana wind pushing against the window glass. She had grown up inside every sound this house made. She knew which step on the staircase groaned if you pressed too hard on the left side. She knew the kitchen smelled like cedar in the mornings because her father had built the shelving himself, cutting the wood from a tree that had fallen during a storm the year she turned 6. She knew the way the light came through the east window at dawn and painted a long gold stripe across the floor, and how her father used to stand in that stripe with his coffee and call it his daily reminder that God was still paying attention. Her father, 3 days gone, and the word still felt wrong in her mouth. He was her father. He used to stand in that light. Charlotte pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and forced herself to sit up. She had things to do, papers to review. The ranch foreman, old Del Hutchins, had asked to speak with her about the seasonal cattle schedule. There were decisions to be made, a property to manage, a life to step into, the life her father had always said would be hers. "This land is your blood, Charlotte," he had told her, not 6 months ago, sitting on the porch in the late summer heat with his hat pushed back and his boots crossed at the ankle. "Every acre of it. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." She had not understood then why he said it with such weight. Why his eyes had gone distant the way they sometimes did when he looked at Margaret across the dinner table. Why he had reached over and pressed her hand between both of his, like he was trying to make her memorize the feeling. She understood now. Charlotte dressed in the dark, pinned her hair back, and went downstairs. Margaret Caldwell Bennet was already in the kitchen. She was not a woman who moved slowly. She never had been. From the day she arrived in Caldwell Creek as the widow of some railroad man from back east, Margaret had moved through every room like she was taking inventory. Sharp eyes, quick hands, a smile that was warm enough on the surface and cold as a January creek bed underneath. Charlotte's father had fallen in love with her inside of 3 months. Charlotte had never quite understood it. But her father was a man who believed in people, who looked for the good in every soul, and usually found it. And she had told herself that if he saw something worth loving in Margaret Caldwell, she would try to see it too. She had tried for 4 years. She was finished trying. Margaret stood at the kitchen table with a stack of documents in front of her. She was dressed in full black, still in mourning clothes, but her posture had none of the grief of the past 3 days. She stood like a woman at the beginning of something, not the end. She looked up when Charlotte walked in. "Good," Margaret said. "You're up. Sit down." It was not a question. Charlotte pulled out a chair and sat. She folded her hands on the table and waited. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, that assessing look Charlotte had never learned to like. And then she reached into the stack of documents and slid a single piece of paper across the table. Charlotte looked at it. "Read it once. Read it again." The words didn't rearrange themselves no matter how many times she went over them. "This is a deed transfer," Charlotte said. "Yes, it has your name on it." "It does. This is my father's ranch." Margaret folded her hands. It was your father's ranch. Your father is dead, Charlotte. The property passes to his surviving spouse. That is the law. That is not. Charlotte stopped, pressed her lips together. Started again. My father told me this land was mine. He said it to my face. He said it in front of witnesses. What your father said and what your father legally documented are two very different things. Margaret's voice was patient in the way a schoolteacher's voice was patient, not because she cared, but because she had done this before and knew exactly how it ended. I have spoken with the county recorder. The property is in order. You spoke with the county recorder. Charlotte heard the flatness in her own voice. When? Yesterday. The day after we buried him. Margaret did not blink. There is no advantage in waiting. Charlotte stood up from the table. She did not slam the chair, did not raise her voice, though both of those things rose up inside her like water behind a dam. She walked to the far side of the kitchen, turned and looked at the woman her father had married. Margaret, she said, I am asking you, plainly and without anger, what are you doing? I am protecting my future. Margaret stood as well, smoothing the front of her dress. You are a grown woman, Charlotte. 25 years old. You are not helpless. You are throwing me out of my home. I am informing you that this is no longer your home. Margaret picked up the deed and set it to the side of the stack. I have arranged for you to have a travel bag. There are $60 inside, which is more than fair. There is a stage leaving Caldwell Creek on Thursday that will take you as far as... I'm not getting on a stage. Charlotte's voice dropped. I'm not leaving. The first real flicker of something crossed Margaret's face. Not regret, not guilt, something colder than either of those. Then you will be removed. Silence sat between them like a third person in the room. Charlotte stared at her. He trusted, yes. Margaret's voice did not waver. He was a trusting man. You inherited that from him. A pause. You also inherited his stubbornness, which I suspect will not serve you as well. Charlotte walked out of the kitchen. She went to her father's study first. She had not been inside since before the funeral. The room still smelled like him, pipe tobacco and leather, and the particular kind of dust that accumulates around a man who reads too many books. His desk was by the window. She sat in his chair, opened the bottom left drawer where he kept his private correspondence, and began to look. She found it in under 10 minutes. Her father had hidden a document inside the back cover of an old account ledger folded 3 times and sealed with wax. Charlotte broke the seal with shaking hands and spread the paper flat on the desk. It was a handwritten statement, dated 8 months ago, witnessed by the town pastor and the county clerk. Her father's handwriting, unmistakable. I, Robert James Bennett, being of sound mind, do hereby declare my intention that all property, land, cattle, and assets bearing the Bennett name shall pass, upon my death, to my daughter, Charlotte May Bennett, born of my first marriage to Eleanor Rose Whitfield. This intention supersedes any transfer made under duress or without my full and informed consent. Charlotte read the whole thing twice. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it inside her bodice against her skin, and went back downstairs. Margaret was in the parlor when Charlotte found her, speaking in low tones with a man Charlotte didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, with the look of a lawyer or a bank officer, his hat in his hands and his expression professionally neutral. Charlotte walked in without knocking Margaret. The man turned. Margaret's eyes went to the paper in Charlotte's hand before anything else, and Charlotte saw it just a flash, quickly buried the recognition of what she was holding. You need to leave us, Charlotte said to the man. Miss, now please. He looked to Margaret. Margaret gave a small nod, and the man excused himself, pulling the parlor door shut behind him. Charlotte set her father's letter on the table between them. Margaret looked at it. She did not reach for it. I found his statement, Charlotte said. Written, dated, and witnessed. You knew about this. I knew he wrote something, Margaret said carefully. I did not know what it said. Then allow me to summarize. He said this land is mine. He said any transfer made under duress was invalid. He protected me, Margaret. Even from the grave, he protected me. Charlotte's voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it, but she kept going. So I am asking you one more time, step aside. Let me speak with the county recorder myself. Let me take what my father intended for me to have. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that document is 8 months old. It's witnessed. It's contested. Margaret's voice was very smooth now, like riverstone worn flat. Documents can be contested, Charlotte, especially handwritten ones. Especially ones produced by a grieving daughter 3 days after her father's death. She tilted her head. Do you have money for a lawyer? Charlotte said nothing. No, Margaret answered for her. You don't, because your father's accounts have already been transferred. I moved quickly, yes, but I moved legally. She reached out and picked up the handwritten statement, turned it over in her hands and set it back down. You can fight me if you choose. You will lose everything in legal fees before you ever see a courtroom. Or you can take the $60, take the travel bag, and start over somewhere else. Charlotte looked at her stepmother for a long time. She looked at the woman who had eaten at their table, who had sat beside her father in the church pew, who had held his hand at the end and cried convincing tears into a black handkerchief. She picked up her father's letter and held it against her side. I will not forget what you've done, Charlotte said. No, Margaret agreed. I don't expect you will. Charlotte turned and walked out. She packed what she could carry. 2 dresses. Her father's pocket watch, which Margaret had not thought to take. A small photograph of her mother, Eleanor, who had died when Charlotte was 4, and who existed in her memory only as a softness, warmth, and lavender, and the memory of being held without any particular reason. She packed her father's letter. She would find a way to use it. She took the $60 from the leather bag on the porch because she was not proud enough to starve, but she did not take the bag itself. She walked out the front door of the house where she had been born and did not look back at it. That was the lie she told herself, that she didn't look back. She looked back. She stood at the gate at the end of the yard and turned around and looked at the house. The white paint her father had put on 3 summers ago. The porch where she had shelled peas as a child and read books as a young woman and sat in the evenings watching the mountains turn purple. The stable where she had learned to ride, where her father had picked her up out of the dirt after her first fall and said, again, Charlotte. You get up and you go again. She stood there until her eyes went dry because she absolutely refused to cry on this road where Margaret might see her from a window. Then she turned north and started walking. The road out of Caldwell Creek ran alongside a flat, dry riverbed for about 3 miles before it bent northwest toward the open range. In July, that stretch of road turned into something close to punishment. No shade, no water, the sky a hard, polished blue overhead, and the sun pushing straight down like it had something to prove. Charlotte had not eaten since the evening before. She had not slept. She had walked nearly 2 miles already, and her good boots, the ones she'd put on because she refused to leave her own home in worn-out shoes, were raising a blister on her left heel. She kept walking. She passed the Henderson turnoff, where a hand-painted sign pointed east toward their farm. She passed the old mill, shuttered now for 3 seasons. She passed Cottonwood Grove, where she and her friend Anna Morrison had played as girls, and she kept her eyes straight ahead and her chin level, because there was nothing useful in looking at the past. She was thinking about Billings. She had a distant cousin there, second cousin, maybe a woman named Ruth who she hadn't spoken to in years. She didn't know if Ruth would take her in. She didn't know what she would do if Ruth didn't. She didn't have enough money for more than a few weeks of modest living, and she had no immediate skills that translated to income outside of ranch work, and there wasn't much call for a woman doing ranch work in any town she could name. She was still working through this problem when she heard hooves. She moved to the edge of the road without looking up. It was a reflex. A woman alone on an empty road learned quickly to take up as little space as possible when riders went past. The hoofbeats slowed. She kept walking. They slowed further, and then stopped, and she heard the particular sound of a horse being held in place, the small, restless shift of hooves, the soft blow of breath. "Excuse me, miss." Low, not unkind. Charlotte stopped walking. She turned slowly and looked at the man on the horse. He was perhaps 35, lean in the way of men who worked outdoors and ate their meals when they had time for them, rather than when they were hungry. Dark hair under a hat that had been on his head long enough to have the shape of his head pressed into it. Dark eyes that were reading her the way a careful man reads a situation without jumping to conclusions. His horse was a good one, bay, well-muscled, with the easy posture of an animal that trusted its rider. The man sat it naturally, reins loose in one hand. He was not from town. She would have remembered him. "You all right?" he said. "Fine," Charlotte said. He looked at the road ahead of her. Then at the road behind her, at the distant outline of Caldwell Creek with its water tower and church steeple. Then back at her. "You walking to somewhere specific," he said, "or just walking?" It was an odd question. She liked it better than "Where's your husband?" or "You need help," "Little lady," or any of the other things men on horses said to women on foot. "Somewhere specific," she said. "Eventually. Long way to eventually from here." "I'm aware." He was quiet for a moment. His horse shifted, and he stilled it with a small movement of his knee. "My name is Wyatt Mercer," he said. "I have a ranch about 4 miles northeast of here." Mercer Creek Ranch. She had heard of it. Most people in 3 counties had. The Mercer Ranch was one of the largest operations in the territory, several thousand acres, good water, a reputation for well-bred cattle and well-treated hands. "Charlotte Bennett," she said. Something moved in his expression when she said her name. Brief. Controlled. "Robert Bennett's daughter," he said. "Yes. I heard about your father. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Bennett." "He was a good man," she said. "The best I've known." Wyatt Mercer turned his hat in his hands once, a small, unconscious gesture, and set it back on his head. "Where are you headed?" Charlotte looked at him directly. She was tired and hungry, and her heel was bleeding inside her boot, and she did not have the energy for anything other than the plain truth. "Somewhere nobody can throw me away," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face went still in the way that faces went still when a thing was said that struck closer to home than the other person expected. "That's a hard answer," he said. "It's an honest one." He was quiet again. A hawk crossed the sky to the west, tilting on a thermal without moving its wings. The road was empty in both directions. "I have a cook who just quit on me," Wyatt Mercer said finally. "Ranch work. Room in the women's bunkhouse. $1.20 a week plus meals." He looked at her steadily. "It isn't charity. It's a job. You'd earn every cent." Charlotte stared at him. She thought about everything that could go wrong with climbing onto the back of a stranger's offer. She thought about what the world had taught her, that kindness came attached to something, that generosity was a transaction, that nothing was ever given freely. She thought about Margaret standing in the kitchen with the deed in her hands and the flat patience in her voice. She thought about $60 and a cousin she hadn't spoken to in 4 years, and a blister on her left heel that was making itself known with every passing second. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked. Wyatt Mercer did not hesitate, and did not look offended. "You don't," he said. "Not yet. But I'll tell you this, Miss Bennett, I'm not the man who put you on this road." She held his gaze. Then she said, "$1.50. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile of one. $1.35, he said. "And I'll have Mrs. Aldrich put a poultice on whatever's making you walk like that." Charlotte almost smiled back. She didn't. $1.40, she said, "and I negotiate my own medical attention." "A beat. Done," Wyatt Mercer said. He moved his horse alongside her, reached down without ceremony, and she took his hand, swung up behind the saddle with the ease of a woman who had been riding since before she could read. He didn't seem surprised by that. They rode in silence for the first mile, the Montana sky enormous overhead, the dry grass moving in the afternoon wind. Charlotte kept her back straight and her hands clasped in her lap, not holding on to him, not leaning in, maintaining every inch of the space between them. After a while, Wyatt spoke without turning his head. "You're Robert Bennett's daughter," he said again. But this time it wasn't a confirmation. It was something else. "He talked about you." Charlotte's throat tightened. "When last spring? He came to look at a bull I had for sale. We ended up talking 3 hours about everything except cattle." A pause. "He said you were the best thing he'd ever done." She did not respond to that. She could not respond to that. She pressed her father's pocket watch against her side, through the fabric of her dress, and looked out at the flat gold distance of the Montana afternoon and did not say a single word for the rest of the ride. Mercer Creek Ranch was everything its reputation promised, and nothing like what she had imagined. She had pictured something austere and businesslike, a working ranch, functional, without sentiment. What she found was a place that had been cared for. The fences were clean. The outbuildings were painted. There were flowers, actual flowers, planted along the front of the main house in a border that looked like someone had thought about it, decided on the colors deliberately. She noticed the flowers and then noticed herself noticing them and told herself it meant nothing. Wyatt dismounted and handed his horse to a young ranch hand who appeared from the direction of the stable with the reflexive speed of someone who had learned to anticipate the boss's return. "Miss Bennett will be starting in the kitchen tomorrow morning," Wyatt said to the boy. "See that Mrs. Aldrich gets her settled in the women's quarters." "Yes, sir." He turned to Charlotte. "Supper is at 6. You don't have to be there tonight if you'd rather rest." "I'll be there," she said. He studied her for a moment, that same careful reading she had noticed on the road. "All right," he said. "Then Miss Bennett, I don't know what happened back in town today. And you don't owe me an explanation." He paused. "But if there's something I should know about whether someone might come looking for you, I'd rather hear it from you than be surprised by it." Charlotte looked at him. "My stepmother took my father's ranch," she said. "She has lawyers and money, and the county recorder in her pocket. I have a handwritten statement from my father that she'll do everything she can to make worthless." She kept her voice even. "If she comes looking, it won't be because she wants me back. It'll be because I'm a loose end she forgot to tie up." Wyatt Mercer was quiet for a long moment. "Then we'll keep an eye out," he said. He turned and walked toward the main house, and Charlotte stood in the yard of a stranger's ranch in the late afternoon light of a July day, with a dead father and a stolen home and $40 less than she'd had that morning. She stood there until her breathing evened out. Then she straightened her dress, picked up the small bundle of her belongings, and followed the young ranch hand toward the women's quarters. She had a job, she had a roof, she had her father's letter tucked against her heart. And she was not done yet. Not even close. That first night, Charlotte sat on the edge of the narrow bunk in the women's quarters and took off her boots and looked at the blister on her heel, which was raw and red and had been making her jaw for the last 2 hours. She cleaned it with the tin of salve. Mrs. Aldrich, a wide, practical woman of about 60 who had looked Charlotte over once and apparently decided she would do, had pressed into her hand without being asked. She wound a strip of clean cloth around her heel, put her boots aside, and lay back on the bunk. The ceiling was plain wood. The room smelled like hay and lantern oil. Somewhere outside, a night bird was calling in short, insistent bursts. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he had looked, near the end, when the illness had taken sculptor, but not 1 ounce of his certainty. He had known, she understood now. He had known something was wrong with his second marriage, long before she had. He had hidden that document, had found witnesses, had done everything a man without legal resources and running out of time could do to protect his daughter. And still Margaret had found a way around it. "You can fight me if you choose," Margaret had said. You will lose everything in legal fees before you ever see a courtroom." Charlotte stared at the plain ceiling. Margaret was right that she couldn't fight her alone. Margaret was right that a handwritten document, no matter how well-intentioned, could be picked apart by a lawyer with enough money and patience. But Margaret had made one mistake. She had told Charlotte exactly how much of a threat that document was by working so hard to dismiss it. A woman who wasn't afraid of something didn't bother explaining all the reasons you should be afraid of it. There was something in that letter worth fighting for. Charlotte just needed time and resources, and someone who knew the law better than Margaret's lawyer did. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would start work. Tomorrow she would learn the lay of this place, prove she was worth the $1.40 a week, and begin figuring out what came next. She was not finished. She was not beaten. She was not the woman her stepmother had decided she was. She was her father's daughter, and her father had always gotten up and gone again. She pressed the pocket watch against her chest one more time in the dark. "Again, Charlotte," his voice said in the back of her mind. "You get up and you go again." She closed her eyes. She slept. Charlotte was up before anyone else on the ranch. That was a choice, not a habit. She had slept 4 hours at most, and when she woke in the gray pre-dawn with her heart already running fast and her father's pocket watch clenched in her fist, she understood that she was not going to sleep again. So she got up. She washed her face with the cold water in the basin, pinned her hair back the way her mother had taught her through some instinct she didn't understand because her mother had been gone since she was 4, and put on her second dress, the practical one, cotton, no ornamentation, and walked out into the dark. She found the kitchen by following the smell of old wood smoke. Mrs. Aldrich was already there. The woman looked up from the cast-iron stove without surprise, the way people who have worked long enough stop being surprised by anything that happens before sunrise. "You don't start until 6, Mrs. Aldrich said. "I know." "You want coffee?" "I want to work," Charlotte said. "Tell me what needs doing." Mrs. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment, the same assessing look she'd given her last evening, the one that took inventory without being unkind about it. "Biscuits," the older woman said finally, and pointed at the flour sack. Charlotte tied on an apron and went to work. She had grown up in a kitchen. Her mother had died young, and her father had employed a series of housekeepers over the years. But Charlotte had always ended up beside whoever was cooking, learning by presence rather than instruction. She knew how to work dough. She knew how to judge a fire's heat with her palm held flat above the grate. She knew that you didn't rush biscuits and you didn't rush the man eating them, and those were 2 lessons that applied to a wider range of situations than cooking. For 20 minutes nobody spoke. The kitchen filled with the sounds of work, the thud of dough, the creak of the stove door, the soft percussion of Mrs. Aldrich moving between her tasks with the economy of someone who had done this 10,000 mornings and expected to do it 10,000 more. Then the older woman said, without looking up, "You the Bennett girl they're talking about in town." Charlotte set the biscuit pan on the counter. "What are they saying?" "That Margaret Caldwell took the ranch before the coffin was cold." Mrs. Aldrich paused. "That you made a scene in the parlor." "I showed her a legal document," Charlotte said. "I wouldn't call that a scene." "In Caldwell Creek, a woman standing her ground is always a scene, Mrs. Aldrich said it without bitterness, just the flatness of long experience. "You know what else they're saying? Tell me. That Margaret's been telling people you've gone unstable with grief. That she was worried about leaving you alone in the house." The older woman glanced over. "She's getting ahead of the story." Charlotte stared at the biscuit pan. Of course she was. Of course Margaret was already out there reshaping the narrative, turning Charlotte from the wronged party into the problem, the hysterical, unstable daughter who couldn't be trusted with her own inheritance. It was exactly what she'd said she would do. Documents can be contested, Charlotte. Especially ones produced by a grieving daughter. "How many people believe her?" Charlotte asked. "Some. Enough." Mrs. Aldrich slid the first tray of biscuits toward the oven. Margaret Caldwell's been buying goodwill in that town for 4 years. She sits on the church committee. She donates to the school fund. She smiles real pretty at the right moments, a pause. Your father was well loved, but he's gone, and people align themselves with whoever's still standing. Charlotte absorbed this. She had known it would be bad. She had not fully understood how efficiently bad it would become. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Mrs. Aldrich gave a short nod and nothing else, and they finished the biscuits in silence. The rest of the morning came at Charlotte fast. The ranch ran on a schedule that didn't count for uncertainty or self-pity, and from the moment the hands began drifting in for breakfast at 6, Charlotte had no room in her head for anything except the immediate demands of the present. 12 men, appetites calibrated to outdoor labor. A kitchen that was well equipped but had been run shorthanded for 2 weeks since the last cook quit. She moved, she poured coffee. She kept the eggs coming and the biscuits warm and learned in under an hour which men took their food without comment, and which ones were going to be difficult. There were 2 in the second category. The first was a broad man named Calhoun, who came in late, looked at Charlotte like she was a piece of furniture since someone had moved without asking, and said to no one in particular, "Mercer hiring townswoman now?" Charlotte put his coffee in front of him without responding. "I'm talking to you," Calhoun said. "I know," Charlotte said. "I'm ignoring you. It'll go faster if you let me." The man beside Calhoun, young, sandy-haired, who she would later learn was called Pete, pressed his lips together and looked very hard at his plate. Calhoun leaned back in his chair. "You got a mouth on you." "And 2 hands and a working knowledge of this kitchen," Charlotte said pleasantly. "Which means you're going to want to stay on my good side, mister." "Calhoun, because I'm the one standing between you and a cold breakfast." Another hand down the table made a sound that was definitely not a laugh. Calhoun's jaw tightened, but he picked up his fork and stopped talking, which was all Charlotte needed from him. The second difficult man was worse because he wasn't obvious about it. His name was Deacon. He was perhaps 40, quiet in a way that felt strategic rather than shy, with a way of watching a people from the corner of his eye while appearing to look at something else entirely. He didn't say anything unpleasant. He just watched her, her movements, her hands, the direction she walked when she left the kitchen, with the particular attention of a man cataloging information he planned to use later. Charlotte noticed and filed it. She would deal with Deacon eventually. For now she had breakfast to finish. She didn't see Wyatt Mercer until after the noon meal. She had wondered about that. He had eaten at the foreman's table, separate from the hands, and left quickly without looking her way. She told herself this was fine, she was staff, he was the employer, there was no reason their paths needed to cross before she'd been here a full day. She was carrying a basket of linens toward the washhouse when he came around the corner of the main barn and nearly walked into her. They both stopped. "Miss Bennett," he said. "How was the morning?" "Productive," she said. He nodded, and then didn't move on immediately the way she expected. He stood there with his hat in his hand and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, not pity, not the professional appraisal of an employer checking on new staff. Something more direct than either of those. "I heard from Dell that you were in the kitchen before 5 this morning," he said. "Your foreman keeps close watch." "He does. It's what I pay him for." A pause. "You don't have to come in before 6. I wanted to get the lay of things." "You also handled Calhoun." She hadn't expected him to know about that. It wasn't a situation that needed handling. It was a situation that needed ignoring. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "He's been here 8 years. He doesn't take well to new people, I noticed. He'll come around." "Or he won't," Charlotte said, "and I'll keep serving him a perfectly hot breakfast regardless." "The work doesn't change because of his opinion." Wyatt looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going into Caldwell Creek on Thursday. Is there anything you need from town?" The question was practical. She answered it practically. "Writing paper if it's not too much trouble." He noted it. He put his hat back on Miss Bennet. He paused, and she had the sense of a man deciding how much to say. What you told me yesterday about the document. Your father's statement. He kept his voice low. Have you spoken to a lawyer? With what money? She said it without self-pity, just the plain arithmetic of it. There's a man in Billings, Wyatt said. Name of Harlan Cross. He handled a boundary dispute for me 3 years back. County recorder tried to reclassify 200 acres of my grazing land. Cross found a 20-year-old survey that settled the matter in under 6 weeks. He paused. He's not cheap, but he works on contingency, when he thinks there's a case worth taking. Charlotte went still. Why are you telling me this? Wyatt held her gaze. Because your father was a good man. And because what was done to you isn't right. And because I have a feeling that document you're carrying is more solid than the woman who took your land wants you to believe. He settled his hat. That's why. She stood in the yard with the linen basket on her hip and looked at this man she had known for less than 24 hours, and for one dangerous moment she felt something inside her chest shift toward trust. She caught it, held it back. I'll think about Billings, she said. That's all I'm asking. He walked on toward the stable. Charlotte stood there another moment, the basket growing heavy against her hip, and told herself firmly that gratitude was not the same as trust, and trust was not something she was giving out freely to anyone right now, no matter how well their profile suited the afternoon light. She went to the washhouse and got to work. The first week passed the way hard work always passed, in a blur of immediate demands that left no room for anything else. Charlotte learned the ranch the way she learned everything, which was by paying close attention and asking one precise question at a time and never asking the same question twice. She learned the water situation: 2 good wells, one suspect which one the hands preferred and which one misses. Aldrich boiled before using. She learned who was reliable and who needed watching. She learned that Pete, the sandy-haired young man who had almost laughed during her exchange with Calhoun, was 17 and homesick and could be persuaded to help carry kitchen supplies from the storehouse if she remembered to say thank you with enough sincerity. She learned that Wyatt Mercer ran his ranch with the particular authority of a man who didn't need to raise his voice because he had never needed to. The hands respected him not with the edgy, watchful respect you gave a volatile man, but the solid kind, built over years. She heard the stories in fragments, gathered from the table and the yard and the occasional, overheard conversation, how he had come to this land at 22 with almost nothing. How he had built the ranch by working longer than everyone around him and making smarter deals than anyone expected from a man that young. How he had lost someone, a woman, years back, and how that had turned him from a man who talked easily into one who chose his words like he was spending something he only had a limited supply of. She didn't ask about the woman. She was not here to ask personal questions of her employer. She was here to work, save money, and figure out how to get her father's ranch back. On the 5th day, she found the account ledger. Not her father's, a different one. Mrs. Aldrich kept the household accounts, and she had asked Charlotte to update the weekly supply records, a task that involved cross-referencing receipts against the running total. Charlotte had done it in under an hour, but in doing it, she had found something the older woman probably hadn't noticed: a small, consistent discrepancy in the feed and grain records. Someone was billing the ranch for 2% more supply than was actually arriving. It wasn't enormous money. Over a year, it would add up to something significant. She brought it to Mrs. Aldrich first. The older woman looked at the ledger, looked at the receipts, and looked at Charlotte. "I'm going to need you to show me that again, Mrs." Aldrich said. Charlotte showed her. Mrs. Aldrich sat with it for a long moment. "How long has this been going on? Based on the records, I can see at least 8 months. Possibly longer. Who brings the supply orders in?" Charlotte kept her voice neutral. "Deacon signs off on the incoming deliveries." A silence. "You're going to have to bring this to Mr. Mercer," Mrs. Aldrich said. "I know. He's not going to be comfortable hearing it about one of his senior hands. I know that too. Mrs. Aldrich folded her hands on the table. You've been here 5 days. Yes, ma'am. And you're going to walk in there and tell him one of his longest-serving hands has been stealing from him. I'm going to show him the records, Charlotte said. And let him decide what the records mean. The older woman studied her face. Something shifted in her expression, not quite approval, not yet, but the beginning of a reassessment. All right, Mrs. Aldrich said. Go. She knocked on the door of the ranch office and waited. Come in. Wyatt was at his desk, going over what appeared to be grazing schedules. He looked up when she entered, and then looked more closely when he registered her expression. Something wrong? He said. Possibly. Charlotte set the ledger and the receipts on the desk in front of him. I was updating the household supply records and I found a discrepancy. I've marked the relevant entries. He looked at what she'd laid out. He went through it methodically, receipt by receipt, ledger line by ledger line. He did not react outwardly. His face remained even, but something around his eyes went very still, in the way that faces went still when a person was working hard not to let what they were feeling show. Deacon signs off on incoming deliveries, he said. Yes. You knew that before you brought this to me. Yes. He looked at her across the desk. You could have brought this to Dell. He's foreman. Dell and Deacon have worked together for 6 years, Charlotte said. I thought you should see it first. A silence settled over the office. Then Wyatt sat back in his chair and rubbed one hand across his jaw and said in a very controlled voice, How long? 8 months minimum from these records. Possibly more if there are older ledgers I haven't seen. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to make the back of Charlotte's neck prickle. Miss Bennett, he said finally. Yes, you've been here 5 days. I have. And in 5 days you found something my foreman, my head cook, and I myself failed to notice in the better part of a year. Charlotte said nothing. I'm not sure whether to be grateful or embarrassed, he said. Grateful would be more useful, she said. He almost smiled. Didn't quite make it there, but almost. I'll handle Deacon, he said. You don't need to concern yourself with. He knows I found it, Charlotte said. Wyatt stopped. I didn't tell him, she said quickly. But he's been watching me all week. He'll notice that I went through the supply records, and he'll notice that I came to you directly afterward, and he's smart enough to put that together. She paused. I wanted you to know, before he had the opportunity to get in front of the story. Wyatt looked at her for a long, measuring moment. She had the distinct sense that he was recalibrating something, not just his assessment of the Deke situation, but his assessment of her. The woman he'd picked up off the road 5 days ago and offered a job to out of something between practical charity and instinct was turning out to be a different kind of person than the one he thought he'd hired. All right, he said. Stay clear of him until I've had a chance to speak with him. I can manage Deacon. I know you can, Wyatt said. That's not why I'm asking. She looked at him. His voice when he continued was quieter. I'm asking because you've had a hard week, and you don't need to take on anything else that isn't yours to carry. That's all. Charlotte absorbed this. She had been taken care of before by her father, in the deep and matter-of-fact way a good father cared for his daughter. She knew what it felt like. It felt like this a little. This quiet, practical version of it that didn't call attention to itself. She didn't know what to do with it. Thank you, she said, which felt inadequate and was all she had. Thank you, he returned, for bringing it to me. She picked up the ledger, left the receipts, and walked out. In the hallway, she pressed one hand flat against the wall for just a moment and breathed. Then she went back to the kitchen. Deacon was gone by the following morning. Wyatt handled it without drama, which somehow made it feel more final than a scene would have. Deacon's bunk was empty when the hands woke at 5, his belongings cleared out, no note. The word moved through the ranch quietly, not gossip, Just information, and most of the men received it with the flat practicality of people accustomed to the sudden rearrangements of ranch life. Calhoun watched Charlotte across the breakfast table that morning. She set his coffee down without comment. He said, "You're the one who found it." "Good morning, Mr. Calhoun," she said. 8 months that's been going on. Maybe more. He wrapped both hands around his mug. "Dell's fit to be tied. Says he should have caught it himself." "Your foreman is a good man," Charlotte said. "Good men don't expect to be stolen from by people they trust." Calhoun looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not warmth, not yet, but the grudging adjustment of a man who had made a preliminary judgment and was in the process of revising it. "Where'd you learn to read accounts like that?" he asked. "My father," Charlotte said. Calhoun nodded once and went back to his breakfast. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't meant to be. But from a man like Calhoun, the simple fact of asking was more than she'd expected, and she took it for what it was. 2 weeks in, Charlotte had a rhythm. 4:45 wake, kitchen by 5. Breakfast for 12 men and the boss served by 6:15. Mid-morning supply inventory. Noon meal prep starting at 10:30. Afternoon for whatever Mrs. Aldrich needed mending, household accounts, supply orders. Dishes by 8. In bed by 9, up before 5. It was not so different from running a house, except that the scale was larger, and nobody pretended she was doing it out of love. She also, quietly and without announcing it, started teaching herself the cattle side of things. She spent her afternoon hours helping Pete move supply from the storehouse, asking questions along the way that were framed as conversation and were actually information gathering. She picked up Wyatt's discarded copies of the ranch schedule and read them, learning the pattern of the operation, which pastures were rotated when, how the water rights interacted with the neighboring claims, where the weak points in the fence line were. When Dell Hutchins caught her reading a survey map of the property one afternoon, he stared at her for a long enough moment that she thought she had overstepped. "You understand what you're looking at," he said. "Most of it," she said honestly. Dell Hutchins was a spare, weathered man of about 60 who spoke rarely and always precisely. He looked at the map. He looked at her. "That northeast corner," he said. "Where you've got your finger. The boundary marker's wrong," she said. "Or the map is. One of them was drawn before the creek changed course." Dell was quiet for a moment. "Wyatt's known about that for 2 years. We've been meaning to get the county surveyor out." "It could matter a great deal in a property dispute," Charlotte said. "It could," Dell agreed. He took the map from her gently, looked at it, handed it back. "You got somebody coming after this property?" She met his eyes. "Not this property." He understood. She could see it, the quiet connection of a man putting together what he'd heard in pieces. "Wyatt told you about Harlan Cross," Dell said. It was not a question. He mentioned a lawyer in Billings. "Cross is the best land lawyer in the territory." Dell picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the fence post. "Wyatt's been thinking about how to approach him on your behalf." Charlotte went very still. "He didn't mention that," she said carefully. "No," Dell said. "He wouldn't." He put his hat on and walked away. Charlotte stood at the fence with the survey map in her hands and the Montana afternoon going gold around her, and worked very hard at not feeling something she was not ready to feel. The letter came on a Thursday. Pete brought it from the mail run, dropped it on the kitchen table without ceremony, and disappeared back outside. Charlotte saw her name on the envelope and the Caldwell Creek postmark and felt her stomach drop before she'd even broken the seal. It was from Margaret's lawyer. The language was formal and precise, and designed to be intimidating, but Charlotte had grown up watching her father navigate legal correspondence, and she read through the performance to the substance of what was being said. Margaret had filed a petition with the county court to have Robert Bennett's handwritten declaration declared invalid on the grounds of diminished mental capacity at time of writing. Charlotte set the letter down on the table. She picked it up again and read it a second time to make sure she hadn't misread the claim. Margaret was going to argue that Charlotte's father had not been in his right mind when he wrote the declaration, that the illness had affected his judgment, that the document was the product of a man who could no longer be trusted to know his own wishes. She was going to call Robert Bennett incompetent. She was going to drag a good man's name through the legal mud to protect her claim to land she had never earned and did not deserve, and she was going to do it in a courtroom in front of people who had known Robert Bennett for 30 years. Charlotte sat down in the kitchen chair and put the letter on the table and stared at it. Mrs. Aldrich came in from the back hallway, took one look at Charlotte's face, and said, "What happened?" Charlotte told her. The older woman sat down. "Read the letter herself." "Set it back on the table, Lord," she said quietly. "She's going to use his illness against him." Charlotte's voice was steady, but it was the kind of steady that was working very hard. He knew what he was writing. He had witnesses. He was himself until the last week. He never. She stopped. "I know," Mrs. Aldrich said. "She is going to stand up in that courtroom and tell people that my father didn't know his own mind." "I know, honey." Charlotte picked up the letter and stood. "Where are you going?" Mrs. Aldrich asked. "To find Wyatt Mercer," Charlotte said. "I need to go to Billings." She found him at the north fence line, working alongside two of the hands on a section that had come down in a recent windstorm. He was not directing. He was working post-hole digger in his hands, his jacket off, doing the same physical labor as the men around him. She had not expected that. She absorbed it quickly and kept moving. "Mr. Mercer," he turned. Read her face the way he always read things, fast and without fuss. "Excuse us a minute," he said to the hands, and they moved off without comment. Charlotte handed him the letter. He read it. His jaw tightened once, briefly, the only sign of what he was feeling. "When was this filed?" he said. "It's dated last week." "Then the court date isn't set yet. There's time." He folded the letter and handed it back. "I'll wire Harlan Cross today. I can't ask you to." "You're not asking," he said. "I'm offering." He looked at her directly. "And before you tell me you don't want Charity Crossworks contingency on land fraud cases. If he takes this, it costs you nothing until you win." "If I win." "When you win," his voice was completely certain. Charlotte looked at him. The afternoon was wide and dry around them, the smell of cut wood and turned earth coming off the fence repair behind him. He stood with the letter in his hand and that particular steadiness that she had come to recognize as simply the way he was not performed calm, not the careful neutrality of a man managing his feelings, but an actual quality of presence, the kind you couldn't learn and couldn't fake. "Why?" she said. "Not the lawyer's reasoning. Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I've watched you for 3 weeks," he said. "I've watched you come in before sunrise and work past dark. I watched you find a theft that nobody else caught. I watched you handle Calhoun with more grace than he deserved. I watched you read survey maps and ask the right questions and not once feel sorry for yourself in front of anyone." He paused. "And I think about your father telling me you were the best thing he'd ever done. And I think about what's being done to his name in that letter." His voice stayed even, but something underneath it had gone hard. "And I think Margaret Caldwell ought to be afraid of what's coming." Charlotte stood very still. "I'm going to get my ranch back," she said. "I know you are, and when I do, I'm going to pay you back every cent this costs." "I know that too." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm counting on it." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she extended her hand. He took it. They shook, the way two people shook hands, when they had reached an agreement that mattered, firm, brief, without flourish. His hand was calloused and warm, and he let go exactly when she did. "I'll wire Cross this afternoon," he said. "Thank you, Wyatt." She had not used his given name before. She heard herself do it and did not take it back. He didn't seem to need her to. She walked back toward the main house, and she was halfway there when she realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, without making any conscious decision to do it, She had stopped bracing herself every time someone was kind to her. She noticed this. She didn't know yet whether it was wisdom or weakness. But she noticed it. And 300 miles away in Caldwell Creek, Margaret Caldwell signed the legal petition with a smile that felt, for just a moment, less steady than it had the week before. Because somewhere in the back of that careful, calculating mind, Margaret had begun to sense something she hadn't planned for. That the girl she'd thrown out of her own home wasn't going to stay thrown. Harlan Cross arrived on a Wednesday. Charlotte had expected a letter first, a preliminary response to Wyatt's wire, questions about the case, a timeline, the careful distance of a professional man evaluating a situation before committing to it. What she got instead was a man stepping down from the noon stage in Caldwell Creek with a leather briefcase, a dark suit that had seen better days but had been pressed within an inch of its life, and the particular economy of movement that belonged to people who had spent decades walking into rooms where they were not welcome. Wyatt had ridden into town to meet him. Charlotte had come too, over Wyatt's mild suggestion that she didn't need to. She had looked at him and said, "It's my case." He had not argued. Cross was perhaps 55, with gray at his temples and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles that he wore, pushed slightly down his nose so he could look over them at things that required his full attention. He shook Wyatt's hand and then turned to Charlotte, and those eyes went over her in the swift, professional way of a man filing information. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I've read what Mr. Mercer sent me." "I have questions." "I expected you would," Charlotte said. "Ask them. He almost not here. Somewhere we can sit." They went to the back room of the Caldwell Creek Land Office, which Wyatt arranged with 2 words to the clerk at the front desk and the particular quality of presence that opened doors without requiring a scene. Charlotte set her father's handwritten declaration on the table between them and sat with her hands folded, while Cross read it through once, twice, and a third time without speaking. Then he set it down and looked at her over his spectacles. "The witnesses," he said. "Pastor Gerald Whitmore and County Clerk Amos Fitch." "Yes. Fitch is the same county clerk who processed the deed transfer to Margaret Caldwell." Charlotte felt the floor shift slightly under her feet. "I didn't know that. It's the first thing Margaret's lawyer will raise." Cross tapped the document with one finger. "He will argue that Fitch's signature on this declaration is meaningless at best and suspicious at worst, given that the same man subsequently facilitated the deed transfer." "Then Fitch needs to testify," Charlotte said. "Fitch is currently employed by the county government, which Margaret Caldwell has significant influence over." Cross paused. "He is not going to volunteer his cooperation." Charlotte stared at him. "Can he be compelled?" "With a court order, yes. Getting that order requires a judge willing to grant it." Cross folded his hands. "The circuit judge for this county is William Hart. He has presided over 3 property cases in the past 2 years. Margaret Caldwell donated generously to his re-election campaign." The silence in the room had weight. Wyatt, sitting to Charlotte's left, said nothing. She could feel him holding still beside her, not passive, but giving her room. "Then we go above Hart," Charlotte said. Cross looked at her. "You know the federal circuit?" "My father did. He told me once that territorial land disputes could be escalated to federal jurisdiction if there was evidence of coordinated fraud involving public officials." She held Cross's gaze. "Is that still true?" "It is," Cross said slowly. "If you can demonstrate that multiple county officials acted in coordination to facilitate an unlawful property transfer, yes. That's a federal matter." He studied her face. "That's also a very significant claim to prove." "I know," Charlotte said. "But Fitch processed the deed transfer within 36 hours of my father's death. The transfer was dated the day of the funeral." She leaned forward. "That level of speed requires preparation. You don't prepare that fast unless you know the death is coming. And if Fitch knew ahead of time, someone told him. Someone coordinated with him. That's not just a widow taking advantage of her husband's death. That's premeditated fraud." Cross took his spectacles off. cleaned them with a cloth from his breast pocket, put them back on. He looked at Charlotte Bennett the way a man looked at something that surprised him. "How long have you been thinking about this?" he said. "Since the morning she threw me out," Charlotte said. Cross stayed 3 days. He interviewed Charlotte for a combined total of 7 hours, taking notes in a precise shorthand she couldn't read, and asking questions that circled the same facts from different angles, the same technique she recognized of a man who was testing the consistency of a story. Good stories held. Fabricated ones developed small contradictions when approached from the side. Hers held, every time. On the second evening, she found Cross in the ranch office going over documents with Wyatt, the two of them speaking in the low, direct tones of men who respected each other's competence. She knocked and they both looked up. "I need to tell you something I didn't mention in the interviews," she said. Cross gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. "The night before my father died, the last night, he was fully conscious. He asked me to bring him his account ledger. The household one, not the ranch records. He went through it himself. I was in the room." She paused. "He pulled out 3 receipts and told me to keep them. He said I would understand later." Cross was very still. "Where are these receipts?" Charlotte reached into the inside of her bodice and produced a folded piece of paper. She had been carrying them since the morning after her father's funeral, tucked beneath the pocket watch and the declaration, a layer of paper between her skin and the world outside. She set them on the table. Cross unfolded them carefully. His expression gave nothing away, but his hands, she noticed, became very deliberate in their movements, the hands of a man handling something that mattered. "These are payment records," he said. "To Amos Fitch," Charlotte said. "2 payments in the 3 months before my father died. Routed through a ranch supply account, labeled as equipment purchase." Cross looked up from the receipts. "Your father knew," he said. "Yes, he knew Fitch was being paid. He knew Margaret was preparing." "Yes," Charlotte's voice was even, "and he could not stop it, he was too ill. So he documented it. He gave me every piece he could find and told me to keep them because he knew exactly what Margaret was going to do, and he wanted me to be able to prove it." The room was very quiet. Wyatt said, from the corner where he'd been standing, "She's been carrying that since before she walked in here." "I noticed," Cross said. He looked at Charlotte for a long moment, with the expression of a man who had practiced law for 30 years and was revising a calculation. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I came here thinking this was a strong case for territorial court. I am now looking at a federal fraud case. Payment to a public official to facilitate a fraudulent property transfer." He set the receipts down carefully. "If these are authenticated, Margaret Caldwell is not just going to lose this property dispute. She is going to face criminal charges." Charlotte did not smile. "Good," she said. Cross left on Friday with copies of everything, the originals locked in Wyatt's ranch safe, and a timeline that gave them 6 weeks to file before Margaret's petition could be heard by Judge Hart. 6 weeks felt like a great deal of time until it didn't. The first sign that something was wrong came 10 days after Cross left, when Pete rode back from the weekly supply run with a face that was doing a poor job of hiding whatever he'd heard in town. Charlotte caught him in the yard before he made it to the stable. "What happened?" she said. Pete looked at his boots. "Nothing you need to hear from me, Miss Bennett." "Pete." He looked up. He was 17 and genuinely kind-hearted, and he was terrible at maintaining a secret in the presence of someone asking him directly about it. "Margaret Caldwell's been talking," he said. "In town. To anyone who'll listen." He hesitated. "She's saying you've got a man out here. That you left town on purpose. To she's saying you're not a respectable woman, Miss Bennett. She's saying that's why your father's lawyer should consider the source of any evidence that comes out of Mercer Ranch." Charlotte stood very still. "She's attacking my character," she said. "Not a question." Pete looked miserable. "I'm sorry. People or some of them are listening." Mrs. Henderson was in the general store when I was getting the flour order, and she said something about how a woman living on a bachelor's ranch wants something decent. He stopped. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. You did right to tell me, Charlotte said. Thank you. She walked back inside. She stood in the kitchen, alone for a moment before the afternoon tasks required her attention, and breathed through the particular fury of being a woman whose reputation was the most efficient weapon available to the person trying to destroy her. Margaret couldn't touch the legal case. Cross had moved faster than she expected. So she was going to burn the ground Charlotte was standing on and make sure that anything Charlotte said, any evidence she produced, any testimony she gave, arrived in court already tainted by doubt. Is she a trustworthy woman? Well, I've heard she's living out on the Mercer Ranch. And Mr. Mercer is a single man, and draw your own conclusions. But as for me, I would never. Charlotte knew exactly how it sounded. She knew exactly how fast it would spread. She went and found Wyatt before supper. He was in the stable, which was where he often went to think, running a brush down his bay horse's flank with the automatic rhythm of a man whose hands knew the work well enough that his mind could be somewhere else entirely. You've heard, he said before she could speak. Pete told me, Charlotte said. How long have you known? 2 days. He set the brush aside and turned to face her. His expression was controlled, but underneath the control was something that looked like anger, the cold, quiet kind. I was trying to determine the best way to tell you. There's no good way to tell someone their name is being dragged through the mud. She kept her voice level. She's trying to undermine me before I ever set foot in a courtroom. If the jury thinks I'm a woman of questionable morals living off a wealthy man, then any evidence I present looks like the product of collusion or desperation. I know. Which means I need to leave. Wyatt went very still. Charlotte, I need to find somewhere to stay in town, or with a family, somewhere that removes any legitimate question about the appearance of the situation. She said it cleanly, without emotion she couldn't afford right now. I don't want to. This ranch is the only steady ground I've had in 2 months. But Margaret is smart and she's playing this perfectly, and I cannot give her a single inch. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. There's another option, he said. She waited. Dell's sister Anna lives at the east end of the property. Separate house half a mile from here. She's a widow, lives alone, been asking Dell for a boarder for 2 years. He paused. You'd still be on Mercer land, but you'd have separate quarters, a female chaperone in the most technical sense, and the ability to say honestly that you live independently of the main house. Charlotte considered this. Would she have me? I'll ask Dell tonight. She looked at him. This is still going to be used against us. Yes, he said. Margaret will find a way to use everything. But there's a difference between a story that has some truth in it and one that's entirely constructed. The jury will feel that difference, even if they can't articulate it. He held her gaze. And you have evidence. Real evidence. Fitch's payments, your father's declaration, the timeline. No amount of reputation damage changes what those documents say. Charlotte pressed her hands together. I hate this, she said. I know. I hate that she gets to do this, that she gets to make my living situation into a weapon, that the most effective thing she has against me isn't a legal argument, it's a rumor about my character. And it will work on some people, because it always works on some people. Charlotte. His voice was quiet, but it stopped her. She looked at him. She is not won yet. She breathed. No, she said. She hasn't. Then we deal with what's in front of us, he said. One problem at a time. She nodded, straightened her dress. Put her hands at her sides. Ask Dell about his sister, she said. Tonight, he said. Anna Hutchins was 63, small with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen enough of life to have stopped being shocked by most of it. She looked Charlotte over at the door of her house the following morning, listened to Dell's explanation of the situation, and said, How long? Until the court case is settled, Charlotte said. 6 weeks at the outside. You cook better than adequately. Can you tolerate cats? Yes. Then come in, Anna said. I charge $3 a month, and I don't want to hear about it if you don't like the way I make coffee. Charlotte moved her belongings that afternoon. It was a smaller room than the one in the women's bunkhouse, and Anna's coffee was, in fact, very strong. But the house was clean and warm, and Anna herself, once she decided a person was acceptable, turned out to be the kind of company that required nothing and offered a great deal without making a performance of it. On the third evening, sitting at Anna's kitchen table with the remnants of supper between them, Anna looked at Charlotte over her coffee cup and said, "You like him." Charlotte did not ask who she meant. "I respect him," she said carefully. "That's not what I said. It's what I'm saying." Anna made a sound that was not exactly dismissive. "He hasn't looked at a woman seriously since Eleanor Marsh left in '83. 4 years ago. She didn't leave because she wanted to. Her father's business failed and she had to go back east. He's been running that ranch like it's all he is ever since." She drank her coffee. "He looks at you differently. Then he looks at other things." "Anna, I'm not saying you have to do anything about it," the older woman said mildly. "I'm just saying I have eyes." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "I am in the middle of the most important fight of my life," she said. "I don't have room for anything else right now." "I know," Anna said. "I'm just making sure you know it's there when the fight is done." Charlotte did not respond to that. She took her coffee to the window and looked out at the dark, and told herself firmly that the warmth that lived in her chest when she thought about Wyatt Mercer was professional gratitude and nothing else, and she almost believed it. The second twist came on a Tuesday 18 days before the court filing deadline. A man came to Anna's house. Charlotte opened the door to find a stranger, perhaps 40, in town clothes with road dust on them, holding his hat in both hands with the awkward sincerity of someone who had been rehearsing what he was about to say. "Miss Bennet," he said, "my name is Thomas Fitch." "Amos Fitch is my father." The world tilted slightly. Charlotte stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in. He sat when she gestured to the chair. He turned his hat in his hands for a moment, and then set it on the table and looked at her directly. "My father has been ill," he said. "Not like your father not dying, but ill enough that he's had time to think about some things he wishes he'd done differently." He paused. "He knows about the payments. He knows you have the receipts. And he wants to speak to your lawyer before Margaret Caldwell's attorney convinces him that his only option is to protect himself by protecting her." Charlotte sat across from him. "What does your father want?" she said. "Immunity, consideration, if there isn't." Thomas Fitch met her eyes. "He's not a bad man, Miss Bennet. He made a mistake and got in deeper than he intended, and now he's scared. But he knows what he did, and he knows what your father was." And the man stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "He went to your father's funeral. He sat in the back. He said he had to, because he'd wronged him and he needed to see it through." Charlotte stared at him. She thought about a man sitting in the back pew of a funeral and carrying guilt like a stone in his chest, and she did not feel sympathy. She was not capable of sympathy for Amos Fitch right now. Perhaps not ever, but she felt the shape of it. The recognition of it, the understanding that even people who did wrong things were sometimes capable of knowing they had done them. "Wire Harlan Cross," she said. "Tell him Amos Fitch wants to talk. Tell him to come quickly." Thomas Fitch let out a breath that had clearly been held for some time. "Thank you, Miss Bennet." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Your father still has to testify." Cross arrived 4 days later, moving faster than Charlotte had expected, which told her that his read of the Fitch development was the same as hers. This was the piece that changed the shape of everything. He met with Amos Fitch privately first for 2 hours. Then he came to Anna's house with a face that gave nothing away and spread his notes on the kitchen table and said, "Here is what we have." Charlotte sat. Anna, at Charlotte's request, stayed in the room. "Fitch confirms the payments," Cross said. He confirms they came from Margaret Caldwell through a third party, a man named Sellers, who works as her property manager. He confirms that he processed the deed transfer with prior knowledge of Robert Bennett's death, meaning he was told, before your father died, to be prepared for the paperwork. Cross paused. He also confirms something I did not expect. Charlotte waited. Margaret had the deed transfer documents prepared before your father died, Cross said. The papers were drafted 3 months ago. She had been planning this for at least a quarter of a year, while Robert Bennett was still alive. The kitchen was very quiet. Anna made a small, sharp sound. Charlotte said nothing. She thought about her father at the kitchen table, reading the account ledger with shaking hands in the last week of his life. Pulling out those receipts, telling her to keep them. He had known not just that Margaret was preparing. He had known how long she had been preparing. He had known the depth of it. She planned it while he was alive, Charlotte said. Yes, while he was still in that house, while she was still sitting at his table. Yes, Charlotte pressed both hands flat on the table. Can you get a federal filing, she said. With Fitch's testimony, yes. Cross's voice was steady, certain. We file next week. We bypass Judge Hart entirely. This goes to the Territorial Federal Circuit on the grounds of coordinated official fraud. He looked at her. Margaret Caldwell is going to receive a summons within the week after filing. She will know that Fitch has turned. Good, Charlotte said. She may try to move the assets before the court can freeze them. How fast can you get a freeze order? If I file Thursday, I can request emergency asset preservation. The Federal Circuit has authority to issue it within 48 hours if the judge agrees the fraud case has merit. Cross looked at her steadily. And it has merit, Miss Bennett. More than I've seen in most cases I've taken in 30 years. Charlotte absorbed all of this. What do you need from me? She said. Your testimony, your presence at the filing, and Cross hesitated, which he rarely did. Courage. What comes next is going to be difficult. Margaret will not go quietly. She will attack you, your character, your relationship with Mr. Mercer, your mental state, your motives. She will use every tool she has. I know, Charlotte said. Are you prepared for that? Charlotte thought about her father, standing in that stripe of morning light with his coffee, looking at the gold line on the floor and calling it his daily reminder. She threw me out of my home the morning after I buried my father, Charlotte said quietly. She paid a public official to steal my inheritance. She has spent 2 months telling this town that I'm an unstable, disreputable woman who can't be trusted with her own name. She lifted her eyes to Cross. She has not invented a single thing that could happen in that courtroom that is worse than what she has already done to me outside of it. Cross was quiet for a moment. No, he said, I don't suppose she has. He gathered his papers. Thursday, he said. I'll need you and Billings to sign the filing. I'll be there, Charlotte said. She told Wyatt that evening. He had come to Anna's house at the end of the working day, a habit that had developed naturally over the past week, the two of them reviewing the case progress in the hour before dark, keeping each other informed the way partners in a complicated undertaking kept each other informed. She told him about Fitch, about the pre-drafted documents, about the 3 months. She watched his face as she talked. He was controlled. He was always controlled. But by the time she finished, his jaw was set in a way that she had come to recognize as the outer edge of his anger, the place where the lid was firmly on, but the pressure underneath was significant. She was planning it while he was alive, he said. Yes, he was quiet for a moment, and he knew enough. He tried to protect me with what he had. Wyatt looked at the table. Robert Bennett came to my ranch last spring, he said. He spent 3 hours talking about you, about your mind, your backbone, the way you never quit on anything. He paused. He wasn't just being a proud father. I think he was telling someone, because he needed to tell someone who might be in a position to help if things went wrong. Charlotte felt this land. He knew he was running out of time, she said. He was making arrangements, Wyatt said. the only way a sick man could. She looked at him. She thought about her father sitting across from this man she had only known for 2 months, talking about her for 3 hours. Planting something, making sure that somewhere in the world there was a person who knew who Charlotte Bennett was before the worst happened. Her father had sent her to Wyatt Mercer before she ever walked down that road. "He trusted you," she said. "He barely knew me." Wyatt shook his head. "But he was a good judge of character." "He was," Charlotte said. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the last of the evening light was going gold, and then amber, and then fading. And somewhere on the ranch a horse was moving in the corral, and the ordinary sounds of the world continued around them exactly as they always did, paying no attention to the size of the thing that had shifted in that small kitchen. "I need to go to Billings on Thursday," Charlotte said. "Cross needs me to sign the filing." "I'll take you," Wyatt said. "You don't, Charlotte." His voice was quiet and final. "I'll take you." She looked at him. She thought about saying something about what Anna had said, about what she'd been pushing away for 2 months, about what it meant that she could feel, plainly and without confusion. How much his presence in this situation had changed the shape of everything. She didn't say any of it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. They sat together in Anna Hutchins's kitchen as the dark came in around the windows, and the court case waited for Thursday. And Margaret Caldwell was somewhere in Caldwell Creek, not yet knowing that the man she had paid to protect her had just walked into the other camp. And Charlotte Bennett, the woman, who had been thrown out of her own home with $60, and for broken hest, said just days away from filing a federal fraud case that was going to change everything. She was not the same woman who had walked down that road. She was something harder now, and something more certain, and she was not afraid of what was coming. She was ready for it. The ride to Billings took most of Thursday. Wyatt drove the wagon himself, which Charlotte had expected, and they left before sunrise, which she had also expected. What she had not expected was the particular quality of silence between them on that long road, not the silence of two people with nothing to say, but the silence of two people who had said enough that the quiet between them had become comfortable, without either of them deciding it would. She had the documents in her lap the entire way. Cross's copies, her father's originals, the receipts, Fitch's signed preliminary statement. She had gone through them so many times in the past week that she could have recited them from memory, but she held them anyway, the way you held something you couldn't afford to lose. Wyatt drove. The Montana morning opened up around them. After about an hour, he said, "How are you feeling?" Charlotte considered the question honestly. "Afraid," she said. "And ready. Both at the same time. That's the right way to feel before something important." "Have you been afraid before something important?" He thought about it. "When I filed for the first water rights on Mercer Creek. When I made the first payroll on a year I wasn't sure I could cover it." A pause. "When Eleanor left." He had not mentioned Eleanor before. Not directly. Charlotte did not push. She let the name sit in the air between them and waited. "She didn't want to leave," he said after a moment. "Her father's business collapsed and she had family obligations back east. It wasn't a choice she made against me." He kept his eyes on the road. "But when someone you love leaves, the reason doesn't change what the empty space feels like." "No," Charlotte said, "it doesn't." He glanced at her briefly. "I closed myself off after that, focused on the ranch. Told myself it was enough, was it?" The question came out more direct than she intended. She felt him register it. "No," he said quietly, "but it was safer." They rode in silence for another mile. Then Charlotte said, "My father used to say that the safest life and the fullest life were not the same life, and you had to choose which one you were willing to live." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. "Smart man," he said. "The best I've known," she said, for the second time. In the same words she had used the first day they met. He heard it. She knew he heard it. Neither of them said anything else for a while, and the road unrolled ahead of them toward Billings and the federal court and the thing that was going to change everything. Cross met them at the court office with his briefcase and a face that was professionally calm and personally keyed up. She could see it in the way he moved, the slight acceleration of his usual economy. "Sellers has been located," he said, before she had fully walked through the door. Charlotte stopped. "Margaret's property manager." "Yes." "The man who passed the payments to Fitch. He was picked up in Helena 2 days ago on an unrelated matter, unpaid debts." When the federal investigator explained the alternative, he chose cooperation over prosecution. Cross set his briefcase on the desk and opened it. His statement corroborates Fitch completely. He confirms he delivered cash payments from Margaret Caldwell on 2 separate occasions. He confirms Margaret told him the transfers were to ensure the deed processing happened quickly and without complications. Charlotte sat down. "That's 3 sources," she said. "The receipts, Fitch, and now Sellers. 3 independent sources corroborating the same sequence of events, yes." Cross spread the documents across the desk. "Margaret Caldwell's attorney is going to have a very difficult morning when this filing lands." "When does she find out?" "The summons will be delivered today once we file." "Federal officers serve it." He looked at her. "Are you ready?" Charlotte picked up the pen. She signed her name to the federal complaint in the clean, deliberate hand her father had taught her, and she did not let it shake. By Friday morning, Caldwell Creek knew. Not the details, those would come out in court, but the fact of it. A federal complaint filed against Margaret Caldwell Bennett for coordinated property fraud and corruption of a public official. The kind of news that moved through a small Montana town the way fire moved through dry grass, fast, complete, and leaving nothing unchanged behind it. Charlotte found out how the town was taking it when she went to the general store for Anna's weekly supply order and walked into a silence that rearranged itself the moment she came through the door. Mrs. Henderson was there. The woman who had spoken at Charlotte's expense in this very store 4 weeks ago, when Pete had overheard. She was standing at the counter with 2 other women, and when Charlotte walked in, all 3 of them turned. Charlotte looked at them directly. She took Anna's list from her pocket, set it on the counter in front of the storekeeper, and said, "Good morning." A beat. Then Mrs. Henderson said, "Miss Bennett, we heard about the federal filing." "Yes," Charlotte said. The woman stopped, started again. "I owe you an apology. What I said some weeks back about your living situation. I was repeating things I had no business repeating, and I should not have said them." The store was very quiet. Charlotte looked at her. She thought about what it had cost her, the weeks of repositioning, moving to Anna's house, navigating the strategic destruction of her reputation while also trying to build a legal case. She thought about what a single, careless, repeated rumor could do to a woman with no protection. "Yes," Charlotte said, "you should not have, Mrs." Henderson flushed. "I accept your apology," Charlotte said. "And I hope that the next time someone tells you something unflattering about a woman who has just buried her father and lost her home, you'll remember this morning." She picked up her supply list and moved to the shelves to begin filling her order. The silence behind her broke slowly, like ice thawing, not gracefully, but inevitably. The asset freeze order came through on Monday. Cross sent word by wire to Wyatt's office, and Wyatt came to find Charlotte himself rather than sending Pete. She was in Anna's kitchen, going over the ranch accounts. She had taken over the bookkeeping entirely now, Mrs. Aldrich having handed it off with the relief of someone surrendering something they'd never been comfortable with. He came through the door with the wire in his hand, and his expression carefully controlled in the specific way that it was controlled when news was significant. She looked up from the ledger. "The freeze went through," he said. Charlotte set down her pen. "Margaret can't touch the assets," he said. "The property, the accounts, the cattle, everything is held, pending the court ruling." Charlotte pressed both hands flat on the table. "The Bennett Ranch. Her father's land. The cedar shelving he had built himself, and the porch where she had shelled peas, and the east window that made a gold stripe on the floor at dawn. Frozen. Preserved. When is the hearing, she said. Cross is petitioning for a date within 30 days. The Federal Circuit is treating it as priority given the public official corruption angle. Wyatt set the wire on the table. He thinks we'll have a date within the week. Charlotte stood up from the table. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to him for a moment, and she breathed very carefully, because the thing rising in her chest was enormous and complicated, and she was not ready to let it out in front of anyone yet. Charlotte. His voice was quiet behind her. I'm all right, she said. I just need a moment. He gave it to her. That was something she had learned about Wyatt Mercer. Over these weeks, he knew when to speak and when to be silent, and he made the distinction instinctively, without having to calculate it. It was the quality of a man who had spent enough time alone to understand that silence was not the same as absence. She turned around. She really thought she'd won, Charlotte said. The morning she threw me out, she was so certain. She had it all arranged, every piece in place, and she looked at me like I was something she was tidying away. Her voice was steady. She didn't know what my father had left me. She underestimated him, Wyatt said. She underestimated both of us. He held her gaze. And then he said something she did not expect. I need to tell you something. About why I stopped on that road. She waited. Your father didn't just talk about you when he came to look at that bull, Wyatt said. At the end of the visit, before he left, he said something that I've thought about since the day I found you walking. He paused. He said, Wyatt, if something happens to me before I get things sorted, Charlotte's going to need someone who won't be moved by the people trying to move them. I hope she finds that person. He stopped. I didn't know what he meant then. I thought he was a worried father talking about the future in general terms. Charlotte was very still. When I saw you on that road, Wyatt said I knew. The kitchen was completely quiet. Charlotte looked at this man who her dying father had, in his careful and deliberate way, chosen. Who had sat and listened to Robert Bennett talk about his daughter for 3 hours on a spring afternoon, not knowing he was being trusted with something. He sent me to you, she said, before I ever needed to come. Yes. She felt the grief of it move through her, not the sharp, breathless kind she'd been carrying since the funeral, but something deeper and more settled, the kind of grief that had room in it for gratitude. Her father had been sick and afraid and running out of time, and he had done what he could. He had planted seeds. He had made sure. He was always 3 steps ahead of everyone, she said. Including Margaret. Especially Margaret. The corner of Wyatt's mouth moved. She's going to find that out in court. Yes, Charlotte said. She is. The court date came on a Thursday 26 days after the filing. It was not in Caldwell Creek Federal Circuit Court, sat in Billings, and Charlotte was grateful for that. Grateful to be on ground that did not belong to Margaret's influence. In a room that operated by rules, Margaret could not bend with donations to the school fund and smiles at the church committee. She wore her best dress, which was the one she'd arrived at Mercer Ranch in the good one, the one she'd refused to leave her home in bad shoes on the worst morning of her life. She had pressed it the night before and pinned her hair back simply, and she looked, Anna told her approvingly, like exactly what she was. What's that? Charlotte had asked. A woman who knows she's right, Anna said. They rode to Billings Wyatt, Charlotte, Cross, and Del Hutchins, who had volunteered to come without being asked and whom nobody had thought to turn away. They arrived the evening before and stayed at a boarding house, and Charlotte slept better than she had in weeks, which surprised her until she understood the reason. The waiting was over. Whatever happened in that courtroom tomorrow, the waiting was done. She had stopped dreading the fight. She was ready for it. Margaret Caldwell sat across the aisle in the federal courtroom like a woman who had not yet accepted that the ground had moved beneath her. She was dressed in black, still mourning, still performing even now. Her lawyer was a man named Prescott, expensive and precise, who had come up from Helena and had the polished, slightly contemptuous bearing of a man accustomed to winning cases in smaller venues by sheer force of presentation. Charlotte sat beside Cross and looked at Margaret once, directly, and then looked away and did not look back. She did not need to watch her stepmother to know what she was feeling. She could feel it from across the room, the first true uncertainty of a woman who had spent 4 months certain of her position, now watching as the edges of that certainty began to fray. The hearing opened with Cross's presentation of the filing and its grounds. He was methodical, precise, and devastatingly organized. 30 years of courtroom practice, distilled into a presentation that moved from evidence to evidence, with the clean logic of a man who had not left a gap for the other side to step into. The receipts, the timeline, Fitch's statement, Sellers' statement. Robert Bennett's handwritten declaration, witnessed and dated 8 months before his death, by a man who had known exactly what was coming. Then Prescott stood up. He was good. Charlotte had to acknowledge that. He attacked the declaration first, the familiar argument about mental capacity, the illness, the question of whether a dying man could be trusted to know his own intentions. He attacked Charlotte's living arrangement, carefully and within the bounds of relevance. He attacked the timing of Fitch's cooperation, suggesting it was motivated by self-interest rather than conscience. He did not attack the receipts. Charlotte noticed that immediately. He said nothing specific about the receipts. She leaned toward Cross and said, very quietly, "He's not touching the physical evidence." "I noticed," Cross murmured back, "because there's nothing to say about it." Then Amos Fitch took the stand. He was a small man, thinner than his son, with the look of someone who had not been sleeping well for a very long time. He sat in the witness chair with his hands in his lap and did not look at Margaret. He looked at Charlotte. She held his gaze. He told the truth. He told it plainly and in detail, in the particular way of a person who has made the decision to stop protecting a lie and is releasing it, not with drama, but with the exhausted relief of someone set down something very heavy. He described the first approach from Sellers, the first payment, the instructions he received about the deed transfer paperwork, the date he was given before Robert Bennett's death to begin preparing the documents, the second payment, after the transfer was complete. He described going to Robert Bennett's funeral. "Why did you go?" Cross asked. Fitch was quiet for a moment. "Because I needed to see what I'd helped to do," he said. "Because I thought if I really looked at it, I might stop telling myself it wasn't as bad as I knew it was." He paused. It was worse. The courtroom was very still. Prescott's cross-examination was aggressive. He attacked Fitch's motivation, his deal with the federal investigators, the reliability of a man testifying to avoid prosecution. Fitch answered every question steadily and without embellishment, which was more persuasive than any amount of emotion would have been. Then Sellers. Then Charlotte. Cross walked her through the morning after the funeral, the conversation in the kitchen, the document her father had hidden in the ledger, the receipts he had pressed into her hands in the last week of his life. He asked her about her father's state of mind when he wrote the declaration. She described it with precision, the date, the witnesses present, specific things her father had said to her that day. Then Prescott stood up for cross-examination. He came at her hard and fast, the way she had expected. "Miss Bennett, isn't it true that you have been residing for the past 2 months on the property of Mr. Wyatt Mercer, a single man with whom you have a personal relationship?" "I resided in the women's quarters of Mercer Ranch for 3 weeks," Charlotte said, "and have resided since then at the home of Mrs. Anna Hutchins, Mr. Mercer's foreman's widowed sister, as a paying boarder. Both arrangements were made in response to the professional nature of my employment at the ranch." "And your current relationship with Mr. Mercer?" "He is my employer, and I believe my friend." She paused one beat. "He is also the man my father spoke with last spring, during which conversation my father indicated his concerns about the security of my inheritance." which suggests that Mr. Mercer's interest in this case predates any personal connection by several months. A murmur in the room. Prescott shifted. "Your father was ill when he wrote this declaration." "My father was ill," Charlotte said. "He was not impaired. The pastor who witnessed his signature will testify to that, as will the physician who attended him in his final months. My father was a man who knew his own mind until his final days, and what he wrote in that declaration was entirely consistent with everything he said to me, to his friends, and to his colleagues across the last year of his life." Prescott tried 2 more approaches. She answered both of them clearly, without heat, without defensiveness, with the composed authority of a woman who knew the truth and was not afraid of being tested against it. When he sat down, there was a quality to the silence in the courtroom that Charlotte recognized. She had said what needed saying. The judge retired to consider. They waited in the hallway, Charlotte, Wyatt, Cross, Dell, and it was not a comfortable wait, but it was a contained one. Cross paced slightly. Dell stood with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Wyatt stood beside Charlotte and did not pace and did not perform calm, just was calm, in the way that was simply his nature. Margaret and her lawyer were at the other end of the hall. Charlotte did not look at her. 40 minutes. Then the bailiff came to the door. Judge Frederick Alcott had been on the federal circuit bench for 19 years. He was a man who delivered rulings the way experienced judges delivered rulings, without theater, without excess, with the clean precision of someone who had done this many times and understood that the people in front of him had been waiting long enough. He summarized the evidence. He noted the corroborating testimony of 2 independent witnesses. He noted the physical evidence of the receipts, authenticated and dated. He noted the declaration's legal validity under territorial law, properly witnessed and in accordance with the written statute. He noted that the speed of the deed transfer 36 hours after Robert Bennett's death, with documents pre-drafted months in advance, demonstrated clear premeditation. He ruled in Charlotte's favor on every count. The Bennett Ranch and all associated assets were to be returned to Charlotte May Bennett as the lawful heir of her father's estate, effective immediately. The deed transfer to Margaret Caldwell Bennett was declared fraudulent and void. The case was referred to the territorial prosecutor for criminal proceedings on charges of property fraud and corruption of a public official. Charlotte heard it the way you heard something enormous in pieces, one word at a time, each one landing before the next could arrive. She held herself completely still until the gavel came down. Then she put both hands over her face and breathed. Wyatt's hand came to her shoulder. She felt it land there warm, steady, certain, and she did not move away from it. Cross was already packing his briefcase, a man moving on to the next practical step because that was who he was. Dell Hutchins, who had barely said 30 words in the past 2 days, put his hat on and said, "Robert Bennett was a good man." "Glad the right thing happened." "So am I," Charlotte said. She lowered her hands. She looked at the front of the courtroom, where Judge Alcott had already moved to the next matter, and at the table where Prescott was speaking in a low, urgent voice to a Margaret who looked, for the first time in Charlotte's memory, like a woman who did not know what happened next. Margaret turned her head and looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked back at her. She did not smile, did not gloat, did not say the things that were available to be said. She simply held the woman's gaze for a steady moment, the gaze of a person who had survived everything that had been done to her and was no longer standing in anyone's shadow, and then she turned away. She had more important things to look at. They ate dinner in Billings that evening, the 4 of them, at a table in a dining room that was not fancy and did not need to be. Cross accepted a glass of whiskey, which Charlotte suspected was unusual for him. Dell ate with the focused efficiency of a man who had not allowed himself to be hungry all day because there was work to do. Wyatt was quiet and present and kept his eyes on Charlotte when he thought she wasn't looking, which she noticed every single time. After dinner, Cross excused himself early. Dell followed. and Charlotte and Wyatt sat at the table in the mostly empty dining room with coffee going cold between them and the particular feeling of a thing finished and a thing beginning hovering somewhere in the space overhead. "I want to go home tomorrow," Charlotte said. "I'll have you there by noon," he said. "To the Bennett Ranch, I mean." She looked at him. "Cross says I can take possession as soon as the paperwork is processed." "That could be as early as next week." "I know." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "It will need work. The cattle schedule has been mismanaged. I could see it in the financial records Cross got access to. Margaret was running it into the ground. Dell can help you assess the operation." "I'd pay him for his time. He'll argue about that." "He can argue all he wants," Charlotte said. "I know how to handle stubborn men." I've had looked at her. "Is that so?" he said. "Don't make that face," she said. "You know perfectly well I'm including you in that category." "I'm not stubborn. You offered to take me to Billings before I finished the sentence." "That's not a flexible man, Wyatt. That's a man who has already decided." "Sometimes deciding fast is the right thing." "Sometimes," she agreed. A small silence. "Charlotte," he set his coffee down. His voice had shifted to the register it took on when he meant something precisely and wanted to be sure she heard it precisely. "I know you're going home next week. I know the ranch is yours and it should be yours. And there's work ahead of you that's going to take everything you have." He paused. "I'm not going to complicate that. You've earned the right to walk through your own door without anything else in the way." She looked at him. "But," she said, "when the dust settles, when you've ranch and its feet and you've had the time to breathe and you've done the things you need to do, I would like to call on you. Formally, in the manner that means something." Charlotte held his gaze. She thought about the road where he had stopped, about the way he had set down food and stepped back, not charity, just a chance. About every morning he had been exactly what she needed and not one thing she hadn't asked for. About her father's voice on a spring afternoon, telling a stranger about his daughter. "I would like that," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, briefly. The same hand she had shaken the day she agreed to $40 a week. The same hand she had taken on the road when he reached down to pull her up. She did not pull away. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that in the dining room of a Billings boarding house on the night of the best day Charlotte Bennett had lived in a very long time, and the coffee went cold, and neither of them moved, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the beginning of something that had been building, quietly and with great patience, from the moment a lone cowboy stopped his horse on an empty Montana road and asked a question that had nothing in it of pity and everything in it of genuine interest in the answer. Charlotte was going home, and for the first time in a long time she was not going alone. The paperwork came through on a Tuesday. Cross sent word by wire, and the wire reached Mercer Ranch at 8:30 in the morning. And Wyatt brought it to Anna's house himself, because he had been waiting for it, the same way Charlotte had been waiting for it, with the particular tension of a person who has won the thing, but cannot fully believe the winning until it is written down and signed and official. Charlotte read the wire once, folded it, set it on Anna's kitchen table. Then she picked up her father's pocket watch, pressed it flat against her chest, and stood very still for 30 seconds. Anna, across the table, said nothing. She had learned, in the weeks Charlotte had been her boarder, exactly when words helped and when they didn't. Wyatt in the doorway waited. Charlotte lowered the watch, straightened her shoulders, looked at them both. "I'm going home today," she said. They rode out together, the three of them, Charlotte, Wyatt, and Dell Hutchins, who had appeared at the gate that morning without being summoned, already saddled, already ready, in the manner of a man who understood that some moments required a witness. The road to the Bennett Ranch was one Charlotte had walked 1,000 times. She had walked it as a child with her father's hand around hers, had ridden it on horseback through every season, had known the exact place where the cottonwoods thinned and the property line began. She knew it today the way she hadn't known it in years, the way you knew a thing when you had come close to losing it. Nobody spoke. When the gate came into view, Charlotte pulled her horse to a stop. She looked at the gate. The painted sign above, been weathered but legible, her grandfather's lettering, preserved across 40 years. Margaret had not taken the sign down. Charlotte wasn't sure whether that was oversight or arrogance. She decided it didn't matter. She rode through the gate. The ranch had been neglected. She had known it from the financial records Cross had obtained, but knowing a thing in numbers was different from standing in the yard and seeing it. Fences that needed attention, a stable door hanging on one hinge. The kitchen garden her father had planted along the south wall, gone to weeds and drought. She walked through all of it without rushing. She walked through the house first, room by room. Alone she had asked Wyatt and Dell to wait outside, and they had, without argument. She needed to see it herself, without anyone watching her face. She stood in her father's study. His desk was still there, cleared of everything but there. She ran her hand along the edge of it. She stood in the kitchen, where Margaret had laid the deed transfer on the table and told her she had no place in this house anymore. She stood in the parlor, where she had set her father's letter between them and refused to be dismissed. She went to the east window in the front room and stood in the stripe of morning light that came through it. It was still there. Of course it was still there. Light didn't care who owned the window. She stood in it for a long moment, pressed the pocket watch against her ribs. Listened to the house breathe. Then she walked back outside. Wyatt was leaning against the fence post where she'd left him, hat in his hands, giving her exactly the privacy she'd asked for and no more. "Well," he said, "it needs work," she said. "A lot?" "Enough to keep me busy for a year." She looked at the property around her, the neglected fences, the dry kitchen garden, the stable door. "But the bones are good. My father built everything to last." "He did," Dell said from the other side of the fence. Charlotte looked at the two of them, these men who had stood beside her without being asked, who had shown up in the particular way that good people showed up, not with fanfare but with presence. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Either of you." Dell put his hat on. "Don't need thanks," he said. "Need that fence line assessed before winter. I'll bring 2 of the boys next week if that suits you." "That suits me." Dell nodded once and walked to his horse. That left her and Wyatt. She looked at him. He looked at her. "It's yours," he said. "Everything it should be." "Not yet," she said. "But it will be." He accepted this with a slight nod, not impatience, just acknowledgement. The recognition of a man who understood that rebuilding was not the same as being given, and that Charlotte Bennett would not have wanted it to be. "I'm going to need a foreman," she said. "Someone who knows cattle. Someone the hands will respect. I know a few good men." "I was thinking Dell might recommend someone." "Dell would probably want to do it himself," Wyatt said. "He's been looking for a reason to cut back his hours at my place for 2 years. Don't tell him I said that, I won't." She paused. "Wyatt." "Yes. You said in Billings that when the dust settled you wanted to call on me formally." He went very still in the way he went still when something mattered. "I did," he said. "The dust is settling." He looked at her. "Then I'd like to come to supper on Friday," he said. "That's all right." "Friday," she said. "Yes." She turned and looked at the house. Her house. Her father's house and her grandfather's house, and now hers reclaimed and whole, and waiting for her to fill it back up with life. "I have a lot of work to do," she said. "You do," he agreed. "You should probably get back to your ranch." "I should," he said. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then Wyatt put his hat on, gathered his reins, and looked down at her from the saddle. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she confirmed. He rode out through the gate, and she watched him go, and then she turned and walked back toward the house, with her syphilis already rolled up and her mind already on fences and cattle schedules and kitchen gardens and every beautiful, exhausting piece of work that was waiting for her. The first week back was the hardest. Not emotionally, she had expected the grief to return when she was inside these walls again. And it did, in waves, the way grief always moved, but practically. The ranch had been run into the ground, in 4 months, more thoroughly than she had understood from the financial records alone. Margaret had sold off a third of the cattle at below-market prices, apparently in an attempt to liquidate assets before the freeze order could take effect. The hay stores were inadequate for winter. 2 of the ranch hands who had worked for her father had left. The ones who remained were demoralized and uncertain. Charlotte called a meeting on the second morning. She had the 4 remaining hands in the kitchen at 7 o'clock, with coffee on the table and a ledger open in front of her. They came in cautiously, the way people came into a room when they weren't sure who was in charge yet. Charlotte looked at each of them. "My name is Charlotte Bennett," she said. "This is my father's ranch, and it is now my ranch, by order of the Federal Circuit Court of Montana Territory. You worked for my father, and I know he valued each of you, which is why you are sitting at this table instead of being given a week's pay and a handshake." She set her hand flat on the ledger. "I also know this operation has been mismanaged for 4 months. I know the hay stores are short. I know the south fence needs 6 days of work minimum. I know 2 of your colleagues left because they didn't know who they were working for." She paused. "I'm telling you now. You're working for Charlotte Bennett. And I intend to run this ranch the way my father ran it: fair wages, honest work, and no man let go without cause." Another pause. "I also intend to rebuild what was taken from this property, and that is going to require every one of you working as if it matters. Because it does." She looked around the table. An older hand named Cooper, who had been with her father for 7 years, said, "What about a foreman, Miss Bennett? We've been without clear direction for a while." "Del Hutchins is coming on Friday to assess the operation," Charlotte said. "He and I are discussing a formal arrangement. Until then, Cooper, you have authority over the hand's daily schedule. I will make the management decisions." Cooper looked at her for a moment, taking her measure the way experienced men took the measure of new authority. Whatever he found appeared to satisfy him. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The rest of the week moved fast. Charlotte slept 4 hours a night and spent the rest conscious in the ledgers, in the fields, in conversation with Del when he came on Friday morning ahead of Wyatt's supper visit. Del walked the property with her for 3 hours and said very little, in the way of a man who was absorbing information rather than performing his usefulness. At the end of the walk, at the north fence line where the repair work was already underway, Del stopped and looked at the operation spread out around them. "Your father would be satisfied," he said. It was the highest praise available from Del Hutchins, and Charlotte received it as such. "Will you come on as foreman?" "Formally. We can negotiate terms." Del was quiet for a long moment. "3 conditions," he said. "Name them. I bring my own tool kit. I don't use anyone else's tools. Done. I have Sundays. Done. You don't let Wyatt Mercer tell you how to run your operation because you're soft on him." Charlotte looked at him. Del looked back at her with the absolute straight face of a man who had just said exactly what he meant. "I am not soft on anyone," she said. "No," Del agreed, with the particular inflection of a man who means the opposite of what he's saying. "You're not." He put out his hand. She shook it. "Welcome to Bennett Ranch, Mr. Hutchins," she said. "Miss Bennett," he said, and went to find Cooper. Wyatt arrived for supper that Friday with his hat in his hand and a jar of Mrs. Aldrich's preserved peaches, which he offered at the door, with the straightforward simplicity of a man who had thought about what to bring and brought the thing he thought of. Charlotte took the peaches and led him inside. She had cooked herself nothing elaborate, the kind of meal a ranch house produced on a working day, but made with the particular care of a person who wanted it to be good. She had also, in a concession to the occasion she did not examine too closely, put a small bunch of wildflowers from the kitchen garden in a jar on the table. The garden was coming back. It had only been a week, But she had cleared the weeds and watered it, and already the mint her father had planted along the edge was reaching back toward the light with the stubborn resilience of a plant that knew it belonged there. Wyatt sat across from her at the table, where the deed transfer had once been laid. That same table, those same chairs, and the weight of that fact was present between them without needing to be named. They talked. They talked the way people talked when they had been through something significant together, and were now discovering, with some surprise, that there was also everything else: the ordinary conversation of two people who found each other interesting, who had opinions and histories and small preferences that had never had occasion to come up before. He told her about his childhood in Wyoming, his father's failed sheep operation, the decision to come to Montana at 22, with a borrowed horse and a conviction that cattle were the future. She told him about her mother, the few things she knew, the things her father had told her, the lavender and the warmth that existed in her memory as impression rather than image. He told her about Eleanor. All of it, this time not the brief mention from the road to Billings, but the actual story, the actual weight of it. A woman he had loved, and a departure that had nothing to do with either of them being wrong, just the wrong circumstances at the wrong time. And the way that kind of loss could teach a person to protect themselves straight past the point where protection was still necessary. 4 years, Charlotte said. 4 years, he confirmed. That's a long time to run a ranch by yourself. It is, he said. I got very good at it. Good at running the ranch? Good at telling myself it was enough. He held her gaze across the table. It wasn't. Charlotte looked at him. She thought about what Anna had said. He looks at you differently than he looks at other things. And she thought about what she had said back, about not having room for anything else right now. And she thought about how the room had opened up in ways she hadn't anticipated the moment the court case was done and the ranch was hers, and the immediate crisis that had required every bit of her capacity had resolved itself. There was room now. There was a great deal of room. Wyatt, she said. Yes, I need to tell you something honestly. All right. When you stopped on that road, when you offered me the job, I thought it was charity with a different name on it. I thought you were a man who felt sorry for something he'd seen, and I told myself that if I worked hard enough and proved my worth quickly enough, I could turn it into something real before you realized you'd acted on impulse. She paused. I was not going to let myself be beholden to someone's pity. Not again. I know, he said. I could see it in the way you negotiated the wage. $1.40 was a fair rate. It was 20 cents above market, he said, but not unkindly. I let you have it because you needed to feel like you'd won something. Charlotte stared at him. You knew, she said. I knew you needed to feel like you were standing on your own, he said. So I let you stand. And then I watched you do it, and I realized fairly quickly that what I'd thought was impulse on that road was actually the clearest decision I'd made in 4 years. He paused. You were never a charity case, Charlotte. You were never even close. She was quiet for a moment. Then what was I, she asked. He looked at her steadily, with the direct and unhurried honesty that was simply who he was. You were the person I'd stopped being willing to look for, he said. And then there you were, on the road, negotiating the wage. The corner of his mouth moved. What was I supposed to do? Charlotte pressed her lips together against something that wanted very much to be a smile. You were supposed to ride on, she said, like any sensible man. I've never been particularly sensible, he said. She let the smile happen. It had been a long time since she had smiled at a table in this house. She was aware of that. She let herself be aware of it, without pulling away from it, because her father had stood in this house and loved it, and the best thing she could do for his memory was fill it back up. Friday supper, she said. Is this something you intend to make a habit of? I intend to make it a standing arrangement, he said, if you'll have me. I'll have you, she said, on the condition that you stop letting me win arguments out of strategy and start telling me directly when I'm wrong. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh genuinely, fully, without the careful control that governed most of his expressions, and it changed his face in a way that was startling and unexpectedly moving. That might be the most dangerous thing anyone has ever asked me to do, he said. You're a brave man, she said. I've seen the evidence. He raised his coffee cup. She raised hers. They drank. 3 months passed. The Bennett ranch came back, the way things came back when the right people were working on them, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, the slow accumulation of good decisions made on consecutive days. Dell ran the operation with the efficient authority of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of work. Cooper proved himself reliable. 2 new hands were hired, both recommended by men whose judgment Charlotte had tested and trusted. The hay stores were replenished before the first frost. The south fence was repaired. The cattle numbers were rebuilt through a combination of careful purchasing and a breeding arrangement with a rancher 2 counties north who had known Charlotte's father and was glad to do business with his daughter. The kitchen garden came all the way back. Charlotte was out there on a Saturday morning, pulling the last of the fall harvest, when she heard a horse at the gate and looked up to find Pete no longer working for Wyatt, having taken on a full-hand position at a ranch near Billings, but apparently passing through, sitting in the saddle with a letter in his hand. From Cross, he said, leaning down to hand it to her. He asked me to bring it personal, since I was coming through. She opened it standing in the kitchen garden with dirt on her hands. Margaret Caldwell had entered a guilty plea. Not to all charges her lawyer had negotiated a reduction, as lawyers did, but to the core count of coordinated property fraud. The criminal sentence was 2 years of supervised restriction and a substantial financial penalty. Amos Fitch, in exchange for his cooperation, received a fine and the loss of his county position. Sellers received 6 months. Charlotte read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. She pulled the rest of the carrots. She was not glad about Margaret's sentence in the way she might once have expected to be glad with heat, with the satisfying fire of a justice that felt like revenge. What she felt was quieter than that, cleaner. The feeling of a thing being finished, a chapter sealed. The particular relief of knowing that what her father had tried to protect and what she had fought to reclaim was now unassailable. No appeal, no reopening done. Margaret had made her choices. They had caught up with her. That was the whole of it. Charlotte went inside and washed her hands and wrote a letter to Cross thanking him. She wrote another, shorter letter to Thomas Fitch, Amos Fitch's son, who had come to her door on the day, that changed everything, telling him that she held no malice toward his family and wished his father whatever was available to a man who had made bad choices and eventually done the right thing. She sealed both letters, set them by the door to go out with the next mail run. Then she went back to work. On a Friday evening in November, 6 weeks after Margaret's plea, Wyatt Mercer arrived for supper with something different in his manner. Not nervous, Wyatt was constitutionally incapable of nervous in the conventional sense. But something was different. He sat down at the table and made ordinary conversation while she finished with the stove, and the ordinary conversation was slightly too ordinary, which was its own kind of tell. Charlotte set the food on the table and sat down across from him. She looked at him. "Whatever it is," she said, "just say it." He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. Then he reached into his jacket and set a small, flat box on the table between them. She looked at the box, looked at him. "Wyatt, before you say anything," he said, "I want to tell you something. And I need you to hear the whole of it before you respond." "All right." He folded his hands on the table. He held her gaze with the steady directness that was his most fundamental quality, the thing that had made her trust him before she intended to. "I watched you walk back into a house where everything had been taken from you," he said. "I watched you stand in front of 4 demoralized ranch hands on your second morning home and tell them who you were and what you intended. I watched you negotiate a foreman's terms with Del Hutchins and hold your own, which is something most men don't manage." He paused. "I watched you write a letter to the son of the man who helped steal from your father. I watched you be larger than the situation every single time the situation tried to make you smaller." Charlotte said nothing. I am not asking you because I feel you need protecting, he said. I am not asking you because I have a ranch and you have a ranch and the practical logic is evident. I am not asking because your father trusted me with the fact of you. He paused one more time. I am asking because I have never in my life known anyone I respected more than I respect you. And because Friday suppers are the best part of my week. And because I would like them to be the best part of every week for the rest of my life. He opened the box. It was her mother's ring. Charlotte went absolutely still. She knew it. She had seen it in the photograph, Eleanor's photograph, the small one she carried on her mother's hand. A simple band with a small stone, not elaborate, not expensive by the measure of such things, but unmistakable. How, she said. Cross found it, Wyatt said, among the personal property the court recovered from Margaret's possession. It was listed as miscellaneous jewelry. He paused. I asked him to hold it when he saw it on the inventory. I thought you might want it. Charlotte looked at the ring. She thought about her mother, whom she did not remember, and her father, who had kept that photograph on his desk for 25 years, and the stripe of morning light that came through the east window, and the pocket watch she still carried every day, and the kitchen garden that had come back, and the fence line that was repaired, and Del Hutchins with his 3 conditions, and Mrs. Aldrich and her no-nonsense salve, and Pete's honest, terrible ability to keep a secret, and Anna's coffee, and the blue Montana sky that went on so far in every direction that a person could spend a lifetime beneath it and never see all of it. She thought about a road, a man who had stopped on it. A question that had nothing in it of pity. She looked up from the ring. You said you wanted to be told directly when you're wrong, she said. He blinked. Ah, yes. You gave a very long speech when a short question would have done. He stared at her. She reached across the table and picked up the ring. Yes, she said. The single word landed in the kitchen of the Bennett Ranch, like a stone dropped in still water clean, definitive, the beginning of rings spreading outward in every direction. Wyatt let out a breath that had been held so still, she hadn't known he was holding it. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him put the ring on her finger, and it fit, of course it fit. It was her mother's ring, and she looked at it for a moment on her hand, where it belonged, where it had always belonged. Friday suppers, she said. Every one of them, he said. You understand I will continue to run this ranch my way. I would not have it any other way, and when we disagree about operational decisions, we will argue about it like adults, he said, and you will win most of the time because you are usually right, and I will be honest with you when you're not. Charlotte looked at him across her father's table in her father's house. She thought about the morning she had stood at the gate of this property with $60 and a leather bag she hadn't taken, and a future that felt like nothing but open road and no destination. She thought about everything that road had carried her through. She thought about what her father had always said, you get up and you go again, and she understood now that going again did not mean going the same way, or going alone, or going without the things that had been taken from you. Going again meant you took what you had, and you moved forward, and you let the road be what it was going to be, because you were stronger than what had been done to you, and you always had been, and you always would be. Charlotte Bennett had been thrown out of her own home by a woman who thought she knew what Charlotte was worth. She had walked down a dusty Montana road with nothing but $60 and her father's watch and the letter he had hidden in a ledger against the day she would need it most. She had worked and fought and testified and refused every single time to be less than what she was. She had brought a federal fraud case against a woman with money and influence and the county recorder in her pocket, and she had won. She had come home, and now she sat at her father's table with her mother's ring on her hand and a man across from her who had stopped on a road when he did not have to stop and had offered a chance when he did not have to offer it, and had stood beside her through every piece of what followed without once trying to make her smaller, to make himself feel larger. She was not the woman Margaret Caldwell had decided she was. She was Robert Bennett's daughter. And Robert Bennett's daughter did not stay thrown. Outside the east window, the November stars were coming out over Montana, cold and clear and certain, the same stars her father had watched from this porch for 30 years, the same stars her mother had known. The same vast and indifferent, and somehow deeply consoling sky that went on in every direction without asking anything of the people beneath it, except that they live fully in whatever time they had. Charlotte Bennett intended to do exactly that. She was home. She was whole. She was exactly where she was always meant to be, and nobody, not now, not ever again, would take that from her.